Smagala had finished his speech, and the moment I had been dreading had arrived. The vicar's turn to speak at the conference, and I'd done nothing to warn him about the threat from the orange eyebrow. At first, he just sat there impassively while the crowd waited for something to happen. After a lengthy pause, he looked up to the heavens with his right hand upturned in front of his chest, moving it gently up and down as if seeking inspiration. He then put his hand back on his thighs before slowly standing and staring at the room. He'd still not said a word when, smiling, he slipped out from behind the table and made his way to the podium where the initial announcer had stood. But why couldn't he just stay behind the table like the other speakers? He was now right out in the open. He again stared silently at the audience, and then, as the weight of his presence weighed on the room, not that he's that heavy, you know, they began to silence themselves, until finally you could have heard the proverbial pin drop. Once he was satisfied that he had complete control, he relaxed his expression and took his wristwatch off his left hand, placing it on the podium in front of him. "Anyone who wishes to take photographs, now is the time," he said, stepping back from the podium slightly. He stood and smiled somewhat reluctantly for the numerous photographers who began to take their photos, any one of whom could have been the orange eyebrow. As the last flash subsided, he moved back to the podium. A member of the audience tried to take one last photograph. "The time has now passed," he said. The photographer still stood there. "If you please," he added, although it sounded more like a command than a request. He stared straight at the photographer, who meekly returned to his seat. The vicar smiled at the audience and picked up his watch from the podium. "It is now 18 years, 2 months, 3 days, 12 hours, and," he looked at his watch, 20 seconds since I began working in the music industry. Throughout that time, there have been numerous changes. The introduction of the CD, for example. None, however, has such far-reaching consequences as the development of the internet." I was probably the only person in the room who was not concentrating fully on what he had to say. Even Venus looked slightly annoyed with me as I tried to squeeze past her and move along the side of the room. Now that everyone was so still and quiet, I had a much better chance of scanning the crowd for my villain, not assuming that he was really there. "Yeah, I work for him. I'm security," I said to all the people who told me to sit down. "You have had 2 differing points of view presented, both discussing the merits of this new technology for the artist. Swapster.com says it helps artists because more people can hear their music, even if it is not paid for directly. Smagala says it is stealing the very bread from the mouths of the musicians." Having worked my way around, I was now nearly at the back of the room. It was virtually impossible to squeeze behind the back row of chairs as the passageway was crammed full of people. "What I find so interesting," the vicar continued, "is the immense concern for the well-being of the artist that both companies are suddenly showing. Let us start with Bruce, the founder of Swapster.com. I suspect that the majority of people who form internet companies do so in the hope that their stock will one day be worth millions. I wonder what his venture capitalists would say if they found out that Bruce is apparently more interested in helping starving artists than making exorbitant profits. And believe me, no company can grow from a valuation of $0 to $30 million, according to the share prices a few days ago," he looked over at Bruce, "without the promise of excessive profits one day." I finally made it across the back of the room and started to work my way down the other side, row by row. "It is, of course, difficult to know how Bruce will actually treat the artists because, at present, of course, like so many internet sites, they are simply abusing copyright and struggling to find a satisfactory business model. I recall Hank Berry, the then CEO of Napster, that most infamous of music sites, saying that he had noticed that most successful businesses have business plans, so he thought he had better create one. Most astute." There was a ripple of laughter in the audience. "I believe Bruce's background is in banking. Some people might suggest that a background in the music business might be useful if you want to start a music company." Cue large-scale applause. This comment went down very well with the audience. "I, of course," the vicar continued, "would suggest that Bruce's total ignorance of anything to do with the music business is the only possible reason why his company might succeed." I'd worked my way halfway up the right-hand side of the room when I spotted Venus waving at me discreetly. She started to quietly point at someone on the front of the floor near the vicar. I couldn't see him from where I was because the camera was in the way. "Equally, I am astounded that Smagala is suddenly so concerned about artists," the vicar continued, "and the fact that the internet is stealing their music. He didn't seem to be so concerned when his own company, several years ago, was found guilty of making thousands of extra copies of CDs and selling them without paying any money to the musicians. At least Bruce is giving the music away, not pocketing all the money and keeping it for himself." he turned to stare at Smagala, who was clearly losing it. "I notice, Vincente, that you do not protest or accuse me of libel, which is, of course, because I am telling the truth. Just as it is true that your United Distribution Company filed for Chapter 11 protection, bankrupting many small labels and their artists, while you continue to pay yourself a 7-figure salary." I was trying to get back around the room to join Venus. "If everyone is so interested in the welfare of artists, perhaps now would be a good moment to conduct a simple survey." I was now climbing over chairs in my haste to get back to the front of the room where Venus was so frantically pointing at someone. "Let us do a little survey to see how trustworthy you feel the record companies are. Anyone who feels that they can name a major label that has always accounted fairly to their artists, even according to their own hideously biased contracts, please raise their hand. If you put up your hand, and I cannot prove in 2 days that this company has been guilty of devious practices, then I will," he paused and smiled, "offer to ruin one of your records for free. If, on the other hand, you are wrong, then you will have to come and work for me for free." He looked at me. Punk is not allowed to put his hand up as he is already working for free. The room turned to look at me just as I made my way past Venus and saw who she was pointing at. A man sitting at the front, not 3 feet away from the vicar, with one of his eyebrows dyed bright orange.
That boy's not cool. He's got ears the size of deer face, broken nose and a twisted face.
I approached my villain from behind and was a bit shaken and stirred to notice that he had eyes on the back of his head. Literally! His scalp was scraped clean with an entire fizzog tattooed on the back. As he searched through the diary, my mind wandered to all the bizarre things that had happened at this conference. The message on the flight, the notes from the Orange Eyebrow, this blatant theft of the Vicar's plan for the Chronicles. I couldn't help thinking that they must all be linked in some way and that Venus Crapperly was almost certainly involved.